The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1882, and with it came the end of everything Grace Whitfield Vernon had ever hoped for. She stood in the dusty parlor of her aunt's boarding house in Palisade, Colorado, her fingers trembling as she read the words that shattered her future. Marriage arrangement terminated. No dowry acceptable. Do not expect further correspondence. Regards, William Hartley. Grace read the words 3 times before the paper slipped from her hands and drifted to the floor like a fallen leaf. 23 years old, and every carefully laid plan had just crumbled to dust. She had been corresponding with William Hartley for 8 months, ever since her Aunt Constance had arranged the introduction through a mutual acquaintance in Denver. He was a banker's son, respectable and educated, and Grace had allowed herself to believe that perhaps this time things would be different, that perhaps someone would want her for more than what she could bring to a marriage in terms of land or money or connections. What does it say? Aunt Constance swept into the room, her black bombazine skirts rustling with the sound of dried corn husks. She was a widow of means, but those means had never extended to generosity toward her late brother's only child. Grace had been living in the boarding house for 2 years now, working as a seamstress to pay for her room and board, ever since her father died and left nothing but debts behind. "He has ended our arrangement," Grace said quietly, bending to retrieve the telegram. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins, falling across her cheek, but she made no move to fix it. What did it matter anymore? Constance snatched the paper from her hand and read it with narrowed eyes. "Well, what did you expect? I told you to be forthright about your circumstances from the beginning. No man of quality wants a wife who brings nothing to the marriage. You have no property, no money, no connections worth mentioning. You are pleasant enough to look at, I suppose, but that hardly makes up for a complete lack of prospects." The words struck like physical blows, but Grace had heard variations of them often enough that she had built up a callus around her heart. "I was honest with him. He said it did not matter." Then he was lying, as men do when they think there might be some advantage to it. Constance tossed the telegram onto a side table. "I have 3 new boarders arriving next week. I will need you out of the Rose Room and into the attic space. They are paying customers, and you are not." Grace felt something crack inside her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I pay my way. I have always paid my way. With needlework and mending which barely covers the cost of your meals. No, Grace, I have been patient long enough. You have 1 month to find alternative arrangements. Perhaps you might seek employment as a governess somewhere, or a lady's companion. Surely someone has need of a poor relation with decent manners and a serviceable education." The dismissal in her aunt's voice was complete. Grace stood in the middle of the parlor as Constance swept out again, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender water and the crushing weight of an uncertain future. Through the lace curtains, she could see the main street of Palisade, dusty and golden in the late morning sun. The town sat in the Grand Valley along the Colorado River, surrounded by mesas and the promise of fruit orchards that were just beginning to take root in the rich soil. It was a town of possibilities for some people. For Grace, it had become a trap. She moved to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Across the street, she could see the general store, the saloon, the land office. Men in dusty boots and worn hats moved along the wooden sidewalks, going about their business with purpose and direction. She envied them that sense of place in the world. A rider was coming down the main street at a steady trot, and despite herself, Grace found her attention drawn to him. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, his broad shoulders outlined against the bright sky. Even from this distance, she could see he was tall and lean, wearing the practical clothing of a working cowboy. Dark trousers, a blue shirt faded from many washings, a leather vest, and a hat with a wide brim that shadowed his face. There was something about the way he moved with his horse, as if they were one creature rather than two, that spoke of competence and skill. He reined in at the hitching post outside the general store and dismounted in one fluid motion, and Grace caught a glimpse of his face as he tied off his horse. He was perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and strong, clean features. Even with trail dust coating his clothes, there was something striking about him. Something that made her keep watching even though she knew she should turn away and attend to the pile of mending waiting in her room. The cowboy disappeared into the store, and Grace finally forced herself to step back from the window. This was foolishness. She had more pressing concerns than staring at strangers in the street. She needed to figure out where she would go when her aunt made good on her threat to evict her. Denver, perhaps, though she had no contacts there. Or maybe one of the smaller towns along the railroad line where they might need a seamstress or a teacher. She spent the rest of the day working on alterations for Mrs. Henderson, who ran the millinery shop 2 streets over. The work was fine and required concentration, which was a blessing. It kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning in circles of worry. But as the afternoon shadows grew long and the light began to fade, Grace found her thoughts returning again and again to that telegram, to those cold, final words that had dismissed her so completely. No dowry acceptable. As if she were nothing more than a ledger entry, a transaction that did not balance. As if everything she was, everything she could offer, meant nothing at all without money or land attached to her name. That evening, she took her supper in her room as she often did, eating the simple meal of bread and cold chicken and boiled potatoes while sitting by the window. The street below had grown quiet as businesses closed for the day, and families gathered around their dinner tables. Lamplight glowed golden in windows, and Grace felt the familiar ache of being outside looking in, of not quite belonging anywhere. She was washing her dishes in the basin when she heard raised voices from downstairs. Aunt Constance was arguing with someone, her shrill tones cutting through the evening quiet. Grace dried her hands and moved to her door, opening it just a crack to listen. "I will not have that sort of person in my establishment," Constance was saying. "This is a respectable house." "Madam, I am just looking for a room for a few nights while I conduct some business in town." The second voice was male, deep and calm with a slight drawl that suggested origins further south. "I can pay in advance if that would ease your mind. I do not care if you can pay in gold coins. I have standards, Mr. Nash, and I will not compromise them. Cowboys and drifters can find accommodation elsewhere, perhaps at the boarding house by the railroad depot, where they are less particular about the clientele. I am not a drifter, madam. I own a ranch about 15 miles north of here, up in the Mesa country. I have business at the land office regarding water rights, and I prefer not to make the ride back and forth for the next few days while the matter is settled." Grace found herself moving to the top of the stairs before she consciously decided to do so. From her vantage point, she could see down into the entrance hall where Aunt Constance stood with her arms crossed, blocking the doorway like a stern sentinel. And beyond her, hat in hand, stood the cowboy she had seen earlier that day. Up close, he was even more striking than she had realized. He had taken off his hat, revealing thick dark hair and a face that was all strong lines and angles. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains, and there was an intelligence in them that belied his aunt's dismissive assumption about cowboys and drifters. He stood at least 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean, muscled build that came from hard physical work rather than gymnasium training. "I do not care if you own half the territory, Mr. Nash. My answer is no. Good evening." Constance began to close the door, but the cowboy put his hand up to stop it, not forcefully but firmly. "Madam, I mean no disrespect, but I have ridden a long way today, and I would appreciate knowing where I might find that other boarding house you mentioned. If you could just point me in the right direction." "Grace!" Constance's voice rang out sharply, and Grace jumped. "Stop lurking on the stairs like a common spy and come down here. Show Mr. Nash the way to the depot boarding house. Perhaps the walk will give you some fresh air and clear your head of whatever nonsense has been occupying it today." Grace descended the stairs slowly, acutely aware of the cowboy's eyes on her. When she reached the bottom, she found herself looking up at him, and for a moment their gazes met and held. There was something in his expression, a combination of curiosity and what might have been appreciation, that made her heart skip in a way it had not in a very long time. "I can show you the way," she said quietly. "It is not far." "I would be much obliged, miss." He settled his hat back on his head and stepped aside to let her pass through the door first. His manners were impeccable, despite what Aunt Constance seemed to think about his character. The evening air was cool and fresh after the stuffiness of the boarding house, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant river. Grace pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and started down the front steps. The cowboy fell into step beside her, leading his horse by the reins. The animal was a beautiful bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. They walked in silence for a few moments, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. Grace was intensely aware of his presence beside her, of the fact that he was a stranger and she should perhaps be more cautious, but there was something about him that felt safe rather than threatening. "Your aunt is a formidable woman," he said finally, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice that made Grace's lips twitch despite herself. "She has strong opinions about respectability and proper behavior, and cowboys do not fit her definition of either, I take it." "I am afraid not." Grace glanced up at him. "Though I suspect she would find fault with most people if given the opportunity, she is not known for her warm hospitality. Yet she runs a boarding house. Seems like an odd choice of profession for someone who does not care for people." "She inherited it from her late husband. It provides income and social standing of a sort. Those things matter a great deal to her." Grace realized she was being more forthcoming than she should be with a stranger. But there was something about the way he listened, with genuine attention rather than polite pretense, that loosened her tongue. They turned onto a side street that would take them down toward the railroad depot. The sun had set behind the western mesas, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Lamps were being lit in windows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. "I am Isaac Nash," the cowboy said, "though I suppose your aunt made that much clear. I apologize for putting you to this trouble. I should have made other arrangements before riding into town." "Grace Vernon," she replied, "and it is no trouble. I needed the air in any case. Vernon. Any relation to the boarding house Vernons? She was my aunt by marriage. My father was her husband's brother. He died 2 years ago. I am sorry for your loss." The words were simple but carried genuine sympathy. It is a hard thing to lose family. Grace found herself talking more than she had intended to, perhaps because he was a stranger, and she would likely never see him again after tonight. She told him about her father's death, about the debts that had consumed his small estate, about coming to live with Aunt Constance and working to earn her keep. She did not mention the telegram or the broken engagement, but she spoke of her aunt's growing impatience with her presence and the need to find a new situation soon. Isaac listened without interrupting, his attention never wavering even as he managed his horse with easy competence. When she finally fell silent, feeling embarrassed at having revealed so much, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Sounds like you have had a difficult couple of years." "Many people have suffered worse," Grace said, trying to inject some lightness into her tone. "I have a roof over my head and work for my hands. There are blessings to be counted even in difficult circumstances." "That is a gracious way of looking at it." He paused, then added, "Though Grace is your name, so perhaps I should not be surprised." The comment was delivered so straightforwardly that it took Grace a moment to realize he had made something close to a joke. When she did, she found herself smiling, a real smile that felt strange after the grim day she had endured. They had reached the other boarding house, a ramshackle two-story building that had seen better days. Paint was peeling from the clapboards and the front porch sagged ominously. Grace stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned to face Isaac. "This is the place. Mrs. Cooper runs it." "She is, I have heard, less particular about her guests than my aunt." Isaac looked up at the building with an expression that suggested he was wondering if the roof might cave in during the night. "Well, I have slept in worse places. Thank you for guiding me here, Miss Vernon." "I appreciate your kindness. You are welcome, Mr. Nash." Grace found herself reluctant to leave, which was foolish. He was a stranger passing through town, and she had enough complications in her life without adding more. "I hope your business at the land office goes well." "So do I." Water rights are complicated matters, especially in this territory where every drop is precious. But I reckon it will work out one way or another. He paused, studying her face in the lamplight that spilled from the boarding house windows. "Would it be forward of me to ask if you might be willing to have dinner with me tomorrow evening? I find I would like to continue our conversation, and I would like to offer you a proper thank you for your help tonight." Grace's first instinct was to refuse. It would not be proper, and her aunt would be furious if she found out. But then she thought about that telegram, about William Hartley's cold dismissal, about the attic room and the uncertain future, and all the careful propriety that had gotten her precisely nowhere. What did she have to lose by accepting a dinner invitation from a man who seemed genuinely interested in her company? "I would like that," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Where should I meet you?" "You know the hotel restaurant?" "The one attached to the Colorado house?" "I do." "Shall we say 6 o'clock?" "6 o'clock," Grace agreed. They stood looking at each other for a moment longer, and then she turned to go before she could lose her nerve or second-guess the decision. She walked back through the darkening streets with a strange lightness in her chest, as if some burden had been lifted. It was only a dinner, she told herself. One evening of pleasant conversation with an interesting man. It meant nothing beyond that. But still, she found herself smiling as she climbed the stairs to her room, and the smile lingered as she prepared for bed. The next day seemed to drag interminably. Grace worked on Mrs. Henderson's alterations in the morning, forcing herself to concentrate on the tiny stitches even as her mind kept wandering to the evening ahead. She took particular care with her appearance, washing her hair and letting it dry in the sunshine that streamed through her window. She had only 2 good dresses, and she chose the one in deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. It was not fancy, but it was well made and becoming, and it made her feel less like a poor relation and more like a woman of worth. Aunt Constance was occupied with her boarders and paid no attention when Grace left the house at 5:45. The evening was clear and pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wood smoke and the last autumn wildflowers. Grace walked with her head high, trying to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. Isaac was waiting outside the hotel when she arrived, and the way his face lit up when he saw her made something warm unfurl in her chest. He had cleaned up since the previous evening, trading his dusty trail clothes for dark trousers and a white shirt with a black string tie. His boots were polished, and his hair was neatly combed back from his forehead. He looked every inch the respectable rancher rather than the cowboy her aunt had dismissed so contemptuously. "Miss Vernon," he said, offering his arm, "you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Nash. You are very kind." "Isaac, please." "Mr. Nash makes me feel like I should be wearing a banker's suit and carrying a pocket watch." "Then you must call me Grace." She took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him through the fabric of his shirt. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Palisade, with white tablecloths and real china plates. It was still a far cry from the elegant restaurants of Denver or San Francisco, but for a small Colorado town, it represented the height of sophistication. Isaac had reserved a table by the window, and he held Grace's chair for her with the same easy manners he had displayed the night before. They ordered roast beef with potatoes and vegetables, and as they waited for their food, they fell into conversation as naturally as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. Isaac told her about his ranch, about how he had come to Colorado 5 years earlier from Texas with nothing but his horse, his saddle, and a determination to build something of his own. He spoke of the hard work of establishing a ranch in Mesa Country, of the challenges of water and weather, and the constant vigilance required to keep his small herd healthy and growing. "It is not an easy life," he admitted, "but it is mine. Every fence post I drive into the ground, every calf that is born healthy, every sunrise I watch from my front porch, it all belongs to me in a way nothing ever did when I was working for someone else's dream." Grace listened with rapt attention, drawn by the passion in his voice and the clear vision he had for his future. "You speak of it the way some men speak of religion." "Maybe because it is a kind of faith," Isaac said thoughtfully. "Faith that the land will provide if you treat it right. Faith that hard work and honest dealing will see you through the difficult times. Faith that you can build something lasting and worthwhile." He paused, his blue-gray eyes meeting hers across the table. "What about you, Grace? What do you have faith in?" It was such a direct, unexpected question that Grace found herself without an immediate answer. What did she have faith in? Not in family, certainly, given how her aunt treated her. Not in love or marriage after William Hartley's rejection. Not in security or stability, given her current circumstances. "I suppose I have faith that things change," she said finally. "That no situation is permanent, good or bad. That even when everything seems dark, the sun will rise again eventually. That is a good faith to have." Isaac reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a simple gesture that nevertheless sent a shock of warmth through her entire body. "Sounds like you have had reason to need it lately." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and embarrassing. She blinked them back, but not before Isaac had seen them. His expression softened and his hand tightened gently on hers. "I am sorry," she said, trying to pull herself together. "I did not mean to become maudlin. This is supposed to be a pleasant dinner." "It is a pleasant dinner," Isaac assured her. "But that does not mean we can only speak of pleasant things. Life is not all sunshine and easy trails, Grace. Sometimes it helps to share the hard parts with someone who will listen." And so, perhaps because of the kindness in his voice or the genuine concern in his eyes, Grace found herself telling him everything. About the 8 months of correspondence with William Hartley, about the careful hopes she had allowed herself to build, about the telegram that had arrived yesterday morning, and the cold, brutal dismissal it contained. About the fact that she had no dowry, no prospects, no value in the eyes of men who measured a woman's worth by what she could bring to a marriage in material terms. He said no dowry was acceptable, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. As if I were a business proposition that failed to meet the minimum requirements. Isaac's jaw had tightened as she spoke, and now his eyes flashed with something that looked very much like anger. Then he is a fool and a poor excuse for a man. Any man who would reduce you to a balance sheet does not deserve you, Grace, not even close. But he is right, is he not? Grace pulled her hand back, folding both hands in her lap. What am I without a dowry? A seamstress living on her aunt's charity, with no family of consequence and no prospects. Why should any man of means want to marry me when he could find someone who brings property or connections or money to the union? Because you are intelligent and kind and brave, Isaac said with such conviction that Grace looked up in surprise. Because you speak honestly and listen carefully. Because you have weathered hardship without becoming bitter or cruel. Because when you smile, it lights up your whole face like sunrise over the mountains. Because any man with eyes to see and sense to know would consider himself lucky beyond measure to have you as his wife, with or without a dowry. Grace stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. You barely know me. I know enough, Isaac said simply. I know that I have been thinking about you since the moment I saw you at your aunt's boarding house. I know that talking with you feels easier and more natural than it has with anyone else in a very long time. I know that when you told me about that telegram and that worthless man who sent it, I wanted to ride to Denver and knock some sense into him for being too blind to see what he was throwing away. Their food arrived then, interrupting the intensity of the moment. They ate in silence for a few minutes, but it was a companionable silence rather than an awkward one. Grace's mind was racing, trying to process everything Isaac had said. It seemed impossible that this man, this near stranger, could see her so clearly when William Hartley had looked at her for months through letters, and seen nothing but a ledger entry marked insufficient. Tell me more about your ranch, she said finally, needing to steer the conversation into safer waters. You said it is in the Mesa country north of here. Isaac seemed to understand her need to shift topics, and he followed her lead graciously. He told her about the land he had filed on, about the small cabin he had built with his own hands, about his plans to expand his herd, and eventually build a proper house with real windows and wood floors. He spoke of the isolation of ranch life, of going days without seeing another soul, of the challenges and the satisfactions of that kind of existence. It sounds lonely, Grace said. It can be, Isaac admitted. I have a couple of hands who help during the busiest times, but mostly it is just me and the cattle and the land. I will not lie to you, Grace. It is a hard life, and it can be lonely. But it is also beautiful in a way that is hard to describe. The silence of the mesas at dawn, with nothing but the wind and the cry of hawks. The satisfaction of bringing in a healthy calf or fixing a fence that will stand strong against the winter storms. The freedom of answering to no one but yourself and the land. You make it sound appealing despite the hardships. Do I? Isaac smiled, and it transformed his whole face, softening the hard plains and making him look younger. I suppose that is because I love it, hardships and all. A man needs something to work for, something to build. Otherwise, what is the point of any of it? They lingered over dinner far longer than Grace had intended, talking until the restaurant had emptied out and the waiter was giving them pointed looks. Finally, reluctantly, they paid the bill and stepped out into the night. The street was quiet now, with only a few lamps burning in windows and the distant sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. "May I walk you back to your aunt's house?" Isaac asked. "I would like that." They walked slowly, neither of them seeming eager to end the evening. Above them, the stars were beginning to emerge, bright and clear in the dry Colorado air. Grace found herself stealing glances at Isaac's profile, at the strong line of his jaw, and the way his eyes reflected the starlight. She felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that was part attraction and part recognition, as if some essential part of her had found an answering chord in him. When they reached the boarding house, Isaac stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned to face her. He reached out and took both of her hands in his touch warm and gentle. "Grace, I know this is fast, and I know I have no right to ask this after only 2 days, but I am not a man who believes in wasting time when something matters. I would like to see you again tomorrow. And the day after that, and as many days as you will allow me." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Isaac, I do not want you to feel obligated because of what I told you. I did not share my troubles to gain your sympathy." "Sympathy has nothing to do with it," Isaac said firmly. "I am drawn to you, Grace. I have been from the moment I first saw you. The more I learn about you, the more certain I am that you are someone special, someone worth knowing, someone worth, well, everything." "But you hardly know me," Grace protested, even as her heart sang at his words. "Then let me know you better. Give me that chance. I will be in town for at least another 3 or 4 days while I sort out the water rights business. Spend that time with me. If at the end of it you decide I am just another fool cowboy with more dreams than sense, I will ride back to my ranch and trouble you no more. But if you feel even a fraction of what I am feeling, then maybe we can figure out where this might lead." Grace knew she should be cautious. She should protect her heart, especially after the pain of yesterday's telegram. She should remember that she barely knew this man, that he might be no different than William Hartley in the end. But when she looked into Isaac's eyes, she saw nothing but honesty and hope and a kind of intensity that took her breath away. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I would like that." Isaac's smile was brilliant, and before Grace quite realized what was happening, he had pulled her close and pressed a kiss to her forehead, tender and brief but full of promise. Then he stepped back, releasing her hands with obvious reluctance. "Tomorrow, then. I will meet you here at 10 in the morning, if that suits you." 10 in the morning, Grace agreed, feeling slightly dazed. She climbed the steps to the front door and let herself in, turning back once to see Isaac still standing there, watching to make sure she got inside safely. She raised a hand in farewell, and he touched the brim of his hat before turning and striding off into the darkness. Grace floated up the stairs to her room in a haze of confusion and wonder, and something that felt dangerously like hope. She undressed and prepared for bed mechanically, her mind replaying every moment of the evening, every word Isaac had spoken, every look and gesture and touch. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she was being a fool to let herself feel this way, to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, something good might come from the ruins of her broken engagement. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Grace was awake with the sun. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a soft blue that complemented her coloring, and braided her hair into a neat coronet. Aunt Constance was at breakfast with her boarders, and Grace slipped out of the house without being noticed, grateful to avoid questions about where she was going and why. Isaac was waiting at precisely 10 o'clock, mounted on his bay horse and leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white star on her forehead. He dismounted when he saw Grace and greeted her with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Good morning." I thought we might ride out a ways if you are comfortable on horseback. I would like to show you something." "I can ride," Grace assured him. She had learned as a child, though it had been some time since she had been on a horse. Isaac helped her mount, his hands steadying her with easy strength, and then he swung back into his own saddle. They rode out of town heading north, following a trail that wound through the sagebrush and scattered juniper trees. The morning was cool but warming quickly, and the air was so clear that Grace felt she could see for 100 miles. The mesas rose in the distance, their layered cliffs glowing red and gold in the sunlight. Isaac kept the pace easy, accommodating Grace's rustiness in the saddle. They talked as they rode, continuing the conversation from the night before and branching off into new topics. He asked her about her childhood, and she found herself telling him stories she had not thought about in years. About her mother, who had died when Grace was 12. About her father, who had been kind but impractical, always chasing the next opportunity and never quite managing to make any of them pay off. About the books she loved to read, and the dreams she had once harbored of seeing more of the world than just the small corners of Colorado where she had lived. "What stopped you from traveling?" Isaac asked. "Money, primarily, and circumstance. After my mother died, I needed to help keep house for my father. And then after he died, well, I had neither the means nor the opportunity." Grace paused, then added quietly, "I think I let myself become small in a way. I let my world shrink down to what seemed possible rather than what I wanted." "It is not too late to make it bigger again," Isaac said. "The world does not stop offering possibilities just because we have had setbacks." They had been riding for about an hour when Isaac turned off the main trail onto a smaller path that led up into the foothills. The terrain grew rockier, and the horses picked their way carefully among the stones and scrub. And then they crested a rise, and Grace gasped at the sight that spread out before them. They were standing on a high point that looked out over the entire valley. Below them, the town of Palisade was a tiny cluster of buildings beside the silver thread of the Colorado River. Beyond it, the valley stretched for miles, dotted with ranches and farms and the dark green of cottonwood trees along the watercourses. And beyond that, range after range of mountains marched toward the horizon, their peaks still dusted with snow that would not melt until late summer. "This is beautiful," Grace breathed. "I come here sometimes when I am in town," Isaac said. "It helps me remember why I work so hard. All of this it is worth fighting for, worth building a life for." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I wanted you to see it, to understand what I am offering, what my life is like." Grace met his gaze steadily. "Why me, Isaac? You could have your pick of women. Why are you interested in someone with no family? No money, no prospects?" Isaac dismounted and came to help her down from her horse, his hands spanning her waist. But instead of releasing her immediately, he kept his hands there, holding her gently as they stood face to face. "Because none of those things matter to me," he said intently. "I am not looking for a business arrangement, Grace. I am not interested in a dowry or connections or any of the things that men like your William Hartley apparently value. I am looking for a partner. Someone who understands hard work and values honesty. Someone who can appreciate beauty even in harsh places. Someone who makes me want to be better than I am." His hands tightened slightly on her waist. "I am looking for someone like you." "You barely know me," Grace said again, but the protest was weaker this time. "I know enough. And I want to know more. I want to know everything, Grace. Every story, every dream, every fear and hope and secret thought. I want to spend years learning all the details of who you are." He paused, then added more quietly, "I think I am falling in love with you. I think maybe I started falling the moment I saw you on those stairs, looking down at me with those hazel eyes like you could see right through to my soul. Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness this time. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" Isaac reached up to brush the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, his touch infinitely gentle. "Because what if you change your mind? What if you wake up one day and realize that you made a mistake, that you should have chosen someone with more to offer? What if I am not enough? Grace Vernon, listen to me." Isaac cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are all the wealth I need. Do you understand that? You, not your dowry or your family connections or anything else. You, your kindness, your strength, your intelligence, your laughter. That is what I value. That is what I want to build a life around." And then he was kissing her, and Grace was kissing him back, and the world fell away until there was nothing but the two of them standing on that high place above the valley, holding each other as if they could anchor themselves against all the storms the future might bring. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon, and I know I should court you properly for months before asking, but I am not a patient man when I know what I want. Marry me, Grace. Come to the ranch with me and help me build something beautiful. Be my partner in all things." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every practical consideration argued against saying yes. She had known him for less than 3 days. She would be giving up what little security she had for a life of isolation and hard work on a remote ranch. If things went wrong, she would have nothing and no one to fall back on. It was madness to even consider it. But when she looked into Isaac's eyes, she saw her future reflected there. A future of partnership and purpose, of working side by side to build something meaningful. A future where she was valued for herself rather than for what she could bring in material terms. A future with love at the center of it, the kind of love that could weather hardship and grow stronger through adversity. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and strong without hesitation. "Yes, Isaac, I will marry you." The joy that blazed across his face was worth every risk, every uncertainty. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and Grace found herself laughing too, giddy with the sudden turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she had been crushed by rejection and facing an uncertain future. Now she was engaged to a man who looked at her as if she were precious beyond measure, who wanted her exactly as she was, with nothing added or taken away. They spent the rest of the morning on that high place, talking about practical matters now that the emotional weight of the proposal had been lifted. Isaac told her honestly about the realities of ranch life, about the isolation and the hard work and the challenges they would face. Grace listened carefully, asking questions and thinking through what it would mean to leave town and make her life in the Mesa country. "I will not lie to you and pretend it will be easy," Isaac said. "The cabin is small, and the work is hard. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and the winters can be brutal. There will be times when you are alone for days while I am out with the cattle, times when you might question this decision. I need you to understand that before you commit yourself." "I understand," Grace said. "But I also understand that I would rather face hardships with you than live a safe, small life without you. I would rather build something meaningful, even if it is difficult, than settle for security without purpose." "You are sure?" Isaac searched her face as if looking for any sign of doubt. "I am sure," Grace confirmed. She smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in years. "When I told you yesterday that I had faith things would change, I never imagined how quickly or how completely. But this feels right, Isaac. It feels like I have been waiting for this for you, without even knowing it. They rode back to town in the early afternoon, making plans as they went. Isaac needed 2 more days to finalize the water rights issues at the land office. They decided to keep the engagement quiet until that was settled, to avoid any complications with Aunt Constance or town gossips. Isaac would arrange for the marriage to take place as soon as possible, and then they would travel to the ranch together and begin their new life. When they parted at the edge of town, Isaac pulled Grace close for another kiss, this one slow and sweet and full of promise. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same time, same place." "Tomorrow," Grace agreed. She watched him ride away, then made her way back to the boarding house with her head spinning and her heart full. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Grace went through the motions of her usual routine, working on mending projects and helping with the evening meal preparations, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept catching herself smiling for no apparent reason, and more than once, she had to pull her attention back to the task at hand. That evening, Aunt Constance cornered her in the hallway outside her room. "You have been acting very strange today, Grace. Where did you go this morning?" "I went for a walk," Grace said, which was not precisely a lie. "I needed some fresh air and time to think." "Time to think about your situation, I hope," Constance said sharply. "Have you made any progress on finding alternative accommodations? The new boarders arrive in 3 weeks, and I need the Rose room vacant by then." "I am working on it," Grace said, keeping her voice neutral. In truth, the problem had solved itself in the most unexpected way possible, but she was not ready to share that information yet. The next 2 days fell into a pattern of secret meetings and stolen time together. Grace would slip away from the boarding house in the mornings, and she and Isaac would ride out into the countryside or walk along the river, talking and laughing and learning each other's rhythms and patterns. They talked about everything and nothing, from deep philosophical questions to silly observations about the people they passed on the street. Every conversation revealed new layers, new connections, new reasons to believe that this rapid courtship was not madness, but something rare and precious. Isaac told her about his family in Texas, about the older brother who had inherited the family ranch, and the father who had never understood Isaac's need to strike out on his own. He spoke of the years of working as a hired hand, saving every penny and learning the cattle business from the ground up. He talked about his dreams for the ranch, about building a herd that could sustain a family, about eventually having children who would grow up understanding the value of hard work and the beauty of the land. Grace shared her own dreams, some of which she had never spoken aloud to anyone. About wanting to be useful, to contribute something meaningful to the world. About the books she wanted to read and the skills she wanted to learn. About her fear of becoming invisible, of living a life that mattered to no one. Isaac listened to all of it with that same focused attention that had first drawn her to him, never dismissing her thoughts or making her feel foolish for sharing them. On the 3rd day, Isaac completed his business at the land office. He came to meet Grace with triumph written across his face and the official papers tucked safely in his saddlebag. "It is done," he said. "The water rights are secured. The ranch is safe." They celebrated with lunch at the hotel restaurant, and afterward, Isaac took Grace to meet with Reverend Thomas, the Methodist minister who served Palisade and the surrounding communities. The Reverend was a kind man in his 50s with a gentle manner and eyes that seemed to see more than most people. "So you two want to be married," he said after they had explained the situation. His gaze moved between them, assessing. "How long have you known each other?" "For days," Isaac said honestly. "I know it seems hasty, Reverend, but I am certain of my feelings. Grace is the woman I want to spend my life with. And you, Miss Vernon," the Reverend turned his attention to Grace, Are you equally certain? Marriage is a serious commitment, especially to a man you have known such a short time. Grace met his gaze steadily. I am certain, Reverend. I know it is fast, but sometimes you just know when something is right. Isaac is a good man, and I believe we can build a good life together. The Reverend studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I have seen marriages that were carefully planned for years fall apart, and I have seen marriages that began in haste last a lifetime. What matters is not how you begin, but how you go forward. If you are both committed to treating each other with respect and kindness, to working through difficulties rather than running from them, then you have as good a chance as any couple. He agreed to perform the ceremony the following afternoon at the small church on the edge of town. It would be simple, with just the two of them and whatever witnesses the Reverend could round up, but that was fine with both Grace and Isaac. They did not need a grand ceremony. They just needed each other and the promise to build a life together. That evening, Grace finally told Aunt Constance that she would be leaving. She had planned to be diplomatic, to ease into the news, but in the end, she simply stated the facts plainly. I am getting married tomorrow. His name is Isaac Nash, and he owns a ranch north of here. I will be leaving with him immediately after the ceremony. Constance stared at her in open-mouthed astonishment. Married? To whom? I have not seen you courting anyone. We have been seeing each other for the past few days. I realize it is sudden, but we are both certain of our decision. A few days. Constance's voice rose sharply. You have known this man for a few days, and you are going to marry him. Grace, have you lost your mind? You know nothing about him. He could be anyone, a fortune hunter or worse. He is not a fortune hunter, Grace said calmly. I have no fortune to hunt. He is a rancher who has worked hard to build something of his own, and he has asked me to share that life with him. A rancher. Constance said the word as if it tasted foul. You mean a cowboy? You are throwing away any chance of respectability to marry some drifter who happened to catch your eye. What about William Hartley? What about finding a suitable husband with proper prospects? William Hartley made it very clear that I was not suitable for him, Grace said, feeling her own temper beginning to rise. He ended our arrangement because I have no dowry. Isaac does not care about that. He wants me for myself, not for what I can bring to the marriage in terms of property or money. Then he is a fool, and so are you, Constance snapped. You will regret this decision, Grace. You will find yourself stuck on some isolated ranch with a man you barely know, working yourself to the bone with no help and no prospects. And when you realize your mistake, do not come crawling back to me expecting sympathy or assistance. Grace felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She had known her aunt was not affectionate, but she had hoped for at least a modicum of support or good wishes. Clearly, that had been naive. I will not be crawling back, she said quietly. I will make this work, whatever it takes, and you are right about one thing, I barely know Isaac. But in the few days I have known him, he has shown me more kindness and respect than you have shown me in 2 years of living under your roof. So no, I do not regret this decision. I think it is the first truly right thing I have done in a long time. She turned and walked up the stairs to her room, not waiting to hear Constance's response. Her hands were shaking with anger and adrenaline, but underneath those feelings was a fierce joy. She was leaving. She was starting a new life. And she was doing it on her own terms, choosing her own path rather than waiting for someone else to grant her permission to live. Grace spent that evening packing her few belongings. She did not have much. Her 2 good dresses and a few everyday ones, some undergarments and nightclothes, her sewing supplies, a few books that had been her mother's, a daguerreotype of her parents taken on their wedding day. Everything fit into a single carpet bag and a small trunk. It was a meager collection to represent 23 years of life, but Grace felt no regret as she folded and packed each item. She was not leaving much behind because there was not much worth keeping. She slept fitfully that night, her mind too active to fully rest. Every few hours, she would wake and lie in the darkness, thinking about the enormous step she was about to take. Marrying a man she had known for less than a week. Moving to an isolated ranch to live a life she could barely imagine. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and by the time dawn broke, Grace was wide awake and tingling with anticipation. She dressed carefully in her green dress, the one she had worn to dinner with Isaac that first night. It seemed fitting to be married in the same dress where their courtship had truly begun. She braided her hair into an elaborate coronet and pinned it securely, then studied herself in the small mirror over her wash basin. She looked pale but determined, her eyes bright with a combination of nerves and excitement. Isaac arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, driving a wagon rather than riding his horse. The wagon was old but sturdy, and the bed was lined with blankets and supplies. He had dressed in his best clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, a black vest, and a string tie. His boots were polished to a high shine, and his hair was neatly combed back. He looked handsome and solid and real, and the sight of him calmed Grace's nerves. "You look beautiful," he said when she opened the door, and the admiration in his eyes was unmistakable. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." He helped her load her carpetbag and trunk into the wagon, then handed her up onto the seat. Aunt Constance watched from the doorway, her face set in lines of disapproval, but she said nothing. Grace looked back at the boarding house once as they drove away, but she felt no regret, only relief at leaving it behind. The church was small and plain, a simple wooden structure with a modest steeple. Reverend Thomas was waiting inside, along with 2 witnesses he had recruited, Mrs. Abigail Henderson, the milliner for whom Grace had done alterations, and Mr. Samuel Porter, who owned the general store. Both greeted Grace warmly, expressing their surprise at the sudden wedding but offering sincere congratulations. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Grace and Isaac stood before the reverend and repeated the traditional vows, their voices steady and clear. When Isaac slipped a simple gold band onto Grace's finger, she felt tears prick her eyes. The ring was not fancy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and it represented a promise that went deeper than words could express. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thomas said with a smile. "Isaac, you may kiss your bride." Isaac drew Grace close and kissed her gently, and Grace felt the last of her doubts dissolve. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. In the arms of this man who had seen her worth when others had found her lacking, who had chosen her not despite her lack of dowry, but because of who she was as a person. They signed the marriage certificate, and Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Porter signed as witnesses. Mrs. Henderson pressed a small wrapped package into Grace's hands as they prepared to leave. "Just a little wedding gift," she said. "Some lace I have been saving for something special. I think you will have use for it in your new home." Grace hugged her impulsively, grateful for the kindness. Thank you for being here." "I am glad I could witness it," Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "You deserve happiness, Grace. I hope you find it with your cowboy." Isaac helped Grace back into the wagon, and they drove out of Palisade, heading north toward the ranch. The afternoon was bright and clear, with a cool breeze that carried the scent of autumn. Grace sat close to Isaac on the wagon seat, her hand in his, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. They were married. She was Grace Nash now, no longer Grace Vernon. It felt strange and new and wonderful. The journey to the ranch took several hours over rough terrain. They followed a trail that wound through sagebrush flats and up into the mesa country, climbing steadily higher. The landscape was stark but beautiful, with red rock formations rising against the blue sky and juniper trees clinging to improbable crevices in the stone. Grace could see why Isaac loved it. There was a wild, untamed quality to this land that called to something deep inside her. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isaac pointed ahead. "There, that is home." Grace followed his gesture and saw a small cabin nestled in a shallow valley between two mesas. It was tiny compared to the vastness of the landscape around it, but it looked solid and well built. Corrals and outbuildings clustered around it, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and as they drew closer, Grace saw a man emerge from the cabin and wave. "That is Tom Fletcher," Isaac explained. "He is one of my hands. He has been watching the place while I was in town. Good man, reliable." Tom was in his 40s, weathered and lean, with graying hair and a quiet manner. He greeted them with a nod and a smile. "Boss, madam, congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you, Tom," Isaac said, hopping down from the wagon. "This is my wife, Grace." Grace liked the way he said it, with such pride and satisfaction. Isaac helped her down from the wagon, and Tom tipped his hat to her respectfully. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Nash. I have got some stew cooking inside, figured you would be hungry after the journey." "That is very thoughtful," Grace said. "Thank you." The cabin was indeed small, consisting of a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a separate small bedroom at one end and a loft above for storage and extra sleeping space. But it was clean and well maintained, with a stone fireplace that radiated warmth and light. Simple furniture filled the space: a sturdy table with benches, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with supplies and books. It was spare and practical, but Grace could see the potential in it. With some curtains on the windows and a few personal touches, it could be made into a real home. Tom served them the promised stew along with fresh bread, and the three of them sat at the table and ate together. Tom asked polite questions about the wedding and town news, but he did not pry into their private affairs. After the meal, he excused himself and headed to the bunkhouse, leaving Isaac and Grace alone for the first time as husband and wife. Isaac built up the fire while Grace explored the cabin more thoroughly, examining the shelves and the small collection of books, the window that looked out toward the mesas, the bedroom with its simple bed covered in quilts. Everything was clean and well cared for, and she could see Isaac's personality in the small details. The books on ranching and animal husbandry, the rope work hanging from pegs on the wall, the carved wooden box on the mantel that held personal items. "What do you think?" Isaac asked, coming to stand behind her. He sounded almost nervous, and Grace realized he was worried about her reaction to his home. She turned to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I think it is perfect. I think we can be happy here." The relief in his eyes was palpable. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood there in the firelight, holding each other as the night settled in around them. Outside, the wind whispered through the junipers, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. But inside the cabin, all was warm and safe and full of promise. That night, they lay together in the narrow bed, learning the contours of each other's bodies, discovering the ways they fit together. Isaac was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure Grace felt safe and cherished. And Grace, who had never known physical intimacy before, found herself responding with a passion that surprised her. There was something profoundly right about this, about being with this man who had chosen her above all others, about the physical expression of the love and commitment they had pledged to each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, talking quietly in the darkness. Isaac told her more about the ranch, about the work that would need to be done before winter set in fully. Grace told him about her plans for the cabin, about the small changes she wanted to make to turn it from a bachelor's living space into a proper home. They talked until they could barely keep their eyes open, and finally, they drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms. Grace woke to the gray light of pre-dawn and the sound of movement in the main room. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake Isaac, and wrapped herself in her shawl before padding out to investigate. Tom Fletcher was building up the fire, and he nodded to her when she appeared. "Morning, Mrs. Nash. Coffee will be ready soon." "Thank you, Tom. You do not have to wait on me, though." "I am perfectly capable of making coffee." "Yes, madam, but figured you might appreciate an extra hour of sleep on your first morning here. It is going to be a busy day." Grace smiled at his thoughtfulness and moved to the window. The valley was emerging from darkness, the mesas taking shape against the lightening sky. She could see the cattle moving slowly through the brush, and in the distance, a hawk was circling on the morning thermals. The beauty of it took her breath away. This was her home now. This wild, stark, beautiful place. Isaac emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, fully dressed and ready for the day's work. He kissed Grace's cheek and accepted a cup of coffee from Tom. Then the two men went outside to begin the morning chores. Grace watched them go, then set about making breakfast and exploring the supplies in the kitchen area. She found flour and salt and eggs, and she set to work making biscuits and frying eggs while the coffee finished brewing. When Isaac and Tom came back in, cold and hungry, they found the table set and breakfast waiting. Isaac's face lit up when he saw what she had done, and he pulled her close for a quick embrace. "A man could get used to this," he said with a grin. "Good, because I intend to make sure you do," Grace replied. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Isaac and Tom worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, checking on the cattle, preparing for the winter that was coming. Grace worked just as hard, learning the routines of ranch life. She cleaned and organized the cabin, putting her own stamp on the space. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to make bread that rose properly and biscuits that were light and fluffy. She learned to preserve vegetables and meat, to make soap and candles, to do the 100 small tasks that were necessary to keep a ranch household running. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done before, but Grace found satisfaction in it. There was something deeply fulfilling about working with her hands, about seeing the direct results of her labor. The cabin became truly home under her care, with curtains on the windows made from fabric she had brought with her, with her mother's books on the shelves, with small touches of beauty and comfort that made the space welcoming. Isaac was an attentive husband, never taking her for granted, always expressing appreciation for what she did. He included her in decisions about the ranch, valuing her opinion and treating her as the partner he had promised she would be. And at night, after the work was done and they lay together in their bed, they talked and laughed and made love with a passion that only grew stronger as they learned each other's bodies and hearts. Tom Fletcher proved to be a godsend. He was an experienced hand who knew the cattle business inside and out, and he taught Grace many of the skills she would need. He showed her how to handle a horse properly, how to spot signs of illness in the cattle, how to read the weather and understand the moods of the land. He was respectful and kind, and Grace came to think of him almost as family. As October gave way to November, the weather began to turn colder. The first snow fell one morning, dusting the mesas with white and transforming the landscape into something even more beautiful. Grace stood at the window watching it fall, marveling at the stillness and peace of it. Isaac came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. "You regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving town, marrying a man you barely knew, coming to this isolated place." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is where I am meant to be, with you, building this life. I have never been happier, Isaac." He kissed her deeply, and Grace felt the truth of her words settle into her bones. She had been rejected for having no dowry, dismissed as inadequate and insufficient. But Isaac had looked at her and seen everything he needed. He had said she was all the wealth he needed, and in doing so, he had given her something far more valuable than property or money. He had given her a sense of worth, a place to belong, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. As winter deepened, the ranch settled into a quieter rhythm. The cattle were brought down to the lower pastures where they could be watched more closely. Tom moved into the bunkhouse full-time, and the three of them worked together to keep everything running smoothly. There were hard days, certainly. Days when the cold was bitter and the wind howled across the mesas like a living thing. Days when Grace's hands were chapped and sore from work, when she wondered if spring would ever come. But there were also moments of transcendent beauty. Mornings when the sun rose over snow-covered peaks and turned the world into a wonderland of glittering ice and gold. Evenings by the fire with Isaac reading aloud from one of their books while Grace did mending and listened to the sound of his voice. Nights when they lay together under piles of quilts and talked about their dreams for the future, about the children they wanted to have, and the life they wanted to build. In January, Grace realized she was pregnant. She kept the suspicion to herself for a few weeks, wanting to be certain before she shared the news. But when there was no longer any doubt, she told Isaac one evening as they were preparing for bed. "Isaac, I have something to tell you." She was nervous despite herself, uncertain how he would react to the news. He turned to look at her, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine. Better than fine, actually." Grace took a deep breath. "I am going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby." The expression on Isaac's face cycled through surprise, disbelief, and then pure, blazing joy. He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around before setting her down gently as if suddenly afraid he might hurt her. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Grace, that is, I do not even have words. This is the best news, the absolute best news." "You are happy then?" Grace asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Isaac said. He pulled her close, more carefully this time, and pressed his hand to her still flat stomach. "Our child, a piece of both of us. God, Grace, you have given me so much. You have made my life complete in ways I never even imagined." "We have given each other so much," Grace corrected gently. "This is not just my gift to you. This is something we created together out of love." They told Tom the next morning, and he congratulated them warmly, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile. "That is wonderful news, Mrs. Nash. This ranch needs the sound of children." As winter gave way to spring, Grace felt the baby growing inside her and marveled at the miracle of it. Isaac became even more protective, insisting that she not overwork herself, taking on tasks that had been hers so that she could rest. Grace protested at first, not wanting to be treated as fragile, but she eventually accepted his care for what it was, an expression of love and concern. The spring work was intense, with calving season keeping all 3 of them busy around the clock. Grace helped where she could, learning the skills of midwifing cattle and caring for newborn calves. It was messy, exhausting work, but she found it deeply satisfying. Life was renewing itself all around them, and she felt connected to that great cycle in a way she never had before. By early summer, Grace's pregnancy was obvious, her belly swelling with the growing child. Isaac talked to the baby constantly, his hand on her stomach, telling stories and making promises. Grace would lie in bed at night listening to him, feeling waves of love so intense they almost hurt. This man who had chosen her, who valued her above all worldly wealth, was going to be the father of her child. It seemed almost too good to be true. On a warm day in late August 1883, Grace went into labor. Isaac sent Tom riding hard for the doctor in Palisade, but the baby was not willing to wait. Grace labored through the afternoon and into the evening, with Isaac at her side holding her hand and offering what comfort he could. He was terrified, she could see it in his eyes, but he tried to hide it for her sake. As the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Grace gave birth to a son. The baby's first cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy, and Grace wept with relief and joy. Isaac cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped his son in clean blankets before placing him in Grace's arms. "He is perfect," Isaac said, his voice choked with emotion. "Grace, you are amazing. He is perfect and you are amazing." Grace looked down at the tiny face, at the dark hair and the eyes that would probably be blue like his father's, and felt her heart expand to make room for this new love. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking about that," Isaac said, settling onto the bed beside her and wrapping his arm around her shoulders so they could both look at their son. "What about James? It was my grandfather's name, a good solid name." "James Nash," Grace said, trying it out. "I like it. Hello, James." "Welcome to the world, little one." The doctor arrived an hour later, riding in with Tom, and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. He stayed the night to make sure there were no complications, and by the next morning he declared Grace was recovering well and the baby was thriving. He left them with instructions and congratulations, and Tom insisted on cooking for the next few days so that Grace could rest and focus on the baby. Those first weeks with James were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Grace was overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping this tiny person alive, but Isaac was a devoted father from the very beginning. He would walk the floor with James when the baby was fussy, would change diapers without complaint, would sit and simply watch his son sleep with an expression of such tender devotion that it made Grace's heart ache. As James grew from an infant into a chubby, bright-eyed baby, the ranch prospered. The herd was growing steadily, and Isaac's reputation as an honest, capable rancher spread through the region. They made friends with other ranching families in the area, and Grace found a community she had never had before. Women who understood the challenges of ranch life, who could offer advice and support and friendship. Grace still remembered Mrs. Henderson in Palisade with affection, but these new friends were different. They were sisters in the trenches of this hard but rewarding life. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. James grew into a sturdy toddler who loved to follow his father around the ranch, trying to imitate everything Isaac did. Grace became pregnant again in 1885, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, with red gold hair and hazel eyes like her mother. And 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Robert. The cabin, which had seemed adequate when it was just the two of them, became cramped with 3 children. Isaac spent the better part of a year building a proper house, a solid structure with multiple bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a front porch that looked out over the valley. When it was finished, Grace walked through it with tears in her eyes. It was more than she had ever dreamed of having. It was a home in the truest sense, filled with love and laughter and the noise of children. Tom Fletcher remained with them all those years, becoming a beloved uncle figure to the children. He taught James to rope and ride, showed Catherine how to gentle a nervous horse, and let little Robert tag along after him like a devoted puppy. He never married, never seemed to want to leave the ranch, and Isaac and Grace were grateful for his steady presence. As the children grew, Grace taught them to read and write, using her mother's books and others they ordered from catalogs. She told them stories of her own childhood, of the hard times and the lessons she had learned. She taught them that a person's worth was not measured in property or wealth, but in character and kindness, and the willingness to work hard for what mattered. Isaac taught them about the land, about respecting the cattle and the horses, about reading the sky for weather and understanding the rhythms of the seasons. He taught them that success came from persistence and patience, from treating others fairly and keeping your word. And by his actions every day, he taught them what it meant to be a good husband and father, to value family above all else. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Grace with a trip to Palisade. They left the children with Tom and a neighboring rancher's wife and made the journey together, just the two of them. It felt strange and wonderful to be alone again, to remember what it had been like in those early days when it was just the two of them against the world. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant where they had eaten on their first date, and afterward, they walked through the town. It had grown in the decades since Grace had left, with new buildings and businesses sprouting up. But the old boarding house was still there, looking shabbier than Grace remembered. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked as they stood looking at the place where Grace had lived. "Leaving so suddenly, marrying me with barely any courtship." Grace looked up at him, at this man who had been her partner and lover and best friend for 10 years. His face had weathered, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun and the beginnings of gray at his temples. But he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, and the love in his eyes when he looked at her had never diminished. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Isaac, you gave me everything when you chose me. A home, a family, a purpose. You saw my worth when others looked right past me. How could I ever regret that? I am the one who gained everything," Isaac said, pulling her close. "You are all the wealth I need, Grace. I said that the day I asked you to marry me, and it is just as true now as it was then. Maybe more true, because now I know exactly how lucky I am to have you." They kissed there in the street, two people who had taken a chance on love and built something beautiful from it. And as they walked back to the hotel hand in hand, Grace thought about that telegram that had arrived so many years ago, the one that had shattered her carefully laid plans and sent her life spinning in a completely different direction. She had been rejected for having no dowry, dismissed as inadequate and unworthy. But that rejection had led her directly to Isaac, who had looked at her with clear eyes and seen everything he needed. He had said she was all the wealth he needed, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift anyone could offer: the chance to be valued for exactly who she was, with nothing added and nothing taken away. They returned to the ranch the next day, and the children came running to greet them, full of stories about their adventures with Tom and demanding to know what presents their parents had brought them. Grace distributed the small gifts they had purchased in town, simple things that nevertheless delighted the children. And as she watched them playing together in the yard, with Isaac standing beside her and Tom watching from the porch with his gentle smile, Grace felt a contentment so complete it almost overwhelmed her. This was wealth, she thought. Not gold or property or bank accounts, but this. Love and family and work that mattered. A place to belong and people who valued you. The freedom to be yourself without pretense or performance. The knowledge that you were building something that would last beyond your own lifetime, something that would echo through your children and their children in turn. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of challenges and sorrows along with the joys. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to the cold, dry summers when the grass turned brown and they worried about water. There were illnesses and injuries, times when Grace sat up all night with a feverish child, or Isaac came home hurt from an encounter with an ornery bull. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and from the life they had built. Tom Fletcher passed away in the winter of 1895, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 63. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the whole family mourned the loss of this man, who had been with them from the very beginning. But even in grief, Grace felt gratitude for the years they had shared with him, for the wisdom he had imparted to her children, for the steadfast loyalty he had shown to their family. James grew into a young man as steady and capable as his father, taking on more and more responsibility for the ranch operations. Catherine surprised them all by showing a talent for training horses, developing a reputation throughout the region for her ability to work with even the most difficult animals. Robert, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book and his head full of questions about the wider world. When James was 21, he married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a bright, capable young woman named Sarah who reminded Grace very much of herself at that age. They built a house on the far side of the property, expanding the Nash Ranch even further. And when Sarah became pregnant a year later, Grace wept with joy at the thought of becoming a grandmother. The grandchildren came in steady succession over the years. James and Sarah had 4 children. Catherine eventually married a veterinarian from Palisade and had 3. And even Robert, who went away to college and seemed destined for city life, returned to the ranch with a wife and started a family. The property that Isaac had claimed with such determination and faith became home to 3 generations of Nashes, all of them learning the lessons of hard work and integrity and the value of family. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Isaac took Grace back to the spot where he had proposed, the high point overlooking the valley. They rode up on horseback, just as they had that first time, though both of them were older now and felt the climb more than they once had. But when they stood at the top and looked out over the land, Grace felt the same sense of wonder she had experienced as a young woman. 25 years, Isaac said, his arm around her waist. It has gone so fast. And yet it feels like we have always been together, Grace replied. I can barely remember what my life was like before you. It was smaller, Isaac said with a smile. You told me that once, remember, that you had let your world become small. I think we both made our worlds bigger by finding each other. Grace leaned into him, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. I used to think that telegram from William Hartley was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it was actually the best thing. If he had not rejected me, I would never have been free to find you. I would have married him and spent my life in some respectable house in Denver, probably miserable but too proper to admit it. Instead, you married a cowboy and spent your life on an isolated ranch in the middle of nowhere, Isaac said dryly. Instead, I married the love of my life and built a home that means everything to me, Grace corrected. Do not sell yourself short, Isaac Nash. You gave me the world when you told me I was all the wealth you needed. You gave me worth and purpose and a family that I treasure beyond measure. You gave me everything that matters. Isaac pulled her close and kissed her, and Grace felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt at 23 when this man had first looked at her with those storm cloud eyes and seen her true value. Age had weathered them both, had left its marks in gray hair and wrinkles, and the inevitable aches and pains of a life of hard work. But the love between them had only grown stronger and deeper, rooted in mutual respect and shared experience, and the thousands of small kindnesses that made up a marriage. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. Below them, they could see the ranch spread out like a living map of their life together. The house Isaac had built with his own hands, the barns and corrals that had been added over the years, the smaller houses where their children lived with their families. Smoke was rising from multiple chimneys, and Grace could imagine the bustle of activity as her daughters-in-law and daughter prepared the evening meals, as her grandchildren played and quarreled and laughed. This was her legacy, she thought. Not property or money, though they had prospered well enough over the years. Her legacy was the family they had created, the values they had instilled, the love that flowed through 3 generations of Nashes. Her legacy was the proof that a person's worth had nothing to do with dowries or social standing, and everything to do with character and heart. As they rode back down to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Grace thought about the girl she had been, standing in that boarding house parlor with a telegram in her hands and her future in ruins. She thought about the despair she had felt, the sense of being worthless and unwanted. And she thought about Isaac riding into town that same day, a cowboy looking for a room and finding instead the woman he would spend his life loving. It had seemed like the end of everything when William Hartley rejected her for having no dowry. But it had actually been the beginning of everything that truly mattered. Because a few days later, she had met a man who looked at her and saw not what she lacked but what she offered. A man who had said, simply and honestly, that she was all the wealth he needed. And in choosing each other, in building a life together out of love and hard work and unwavering commitment, they had created riches beyond measure. Not the kind of wealth that could be counted in bank accounts or measured in acres of land, but the kind that filled the heart and satisfied the soul. The kind that lasted through hardship and grew stronger with time. The kind that was passed down through generations, an inheritance far more valuable than gold. Grace and Isaac lived into their 70s, watching their grandchildren grow and even welcoming the first of their great-grandchildren. They faced the challenges of aging together with the same partnership that had characterized their entire marriage, supporting each other through illness and loss, and the inevitable diminishing of physical strength. But their minds remained sharp, and their love remained constant, a beacon that guided the entire family. On a spring morning in 1912, exactly 30 years after that fateful telegram had arrived, Grace sat on the porch of the house Isaac had built, watching the sun rise over the mesas. She was 73 years old now, her hair completely white and her hands gnarled with age and work. But she still rose early, still loved to watch the day begin. Isaac came out to join her, moving more slowly than he once had but still steady on his feet. He settled into the chair beside hers and took her hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as they had done thousands of times before, simply being together and watching the world wake up. "You remember what today is?" Grace asked. "How could I forget?" Isaac replied. 30 years since that fool in Denver sent you that telegram. 30 years since the best thing that ever happened to me set me free to find you," Grace corrected with a smile. "Still think I am all the wealth you need?" Isaac asked, and despite his age, there was still a glint of mischief in his blue-gray eyes. Grace squeezed his hand and looked at the land spread out before them, at the evidence of the life they had built together. She thought of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them carrying forward the values and love that she and Isaac had worked so hard to instill. She thought of the community they had helped to build, the friends they had made, the lives they had touched. "More than ever," she said firmly. "You are all the wealth I need, Isaac Nash. You have been since the day you told me so, and you always will be." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, two people who had taken a chance on love and built something beautiful from it. They had started with nothing but faith in each other, and that had been more than enough. They had weathered every storm, celebrated every joy, and faced every challenge as partners in the truest sense of the word. Grace had been rejected for having no dowry, dismissed as worthless by a man who could not see past material considerations. But Isaac had looked at her with clear eyes and seen all the wealth that truly mattered: her strength, her kindness, her courage, her capacity for love. He had chosen her not despite what she lacked, but because of who she was, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift anyone could offer: the chance to be valued for herself, the opportunity to build a meaningful life, the blessing of true partnership, the joy of family and home and purpose. These were the riches that mattered, the wealth that endured beyond any material possession. And as Grace sat on that porch with Isaac's hand in hers, watching the sun paint the mesas in shades of gold, she knew with absolute certainty that she was the wealthiest woman alive. Not because of money or property or social standing, but because she had loved and been loved in return. Because she had built something lasting and worthwhile. Because she had lived a life that mattered. She had been told she was insufficient, inadequate, not enough. But Isaac had shown her the truth. She was more than enough. She was everything. She was all the wealth anyone could ever need. And that truth, that fundamental recognition of her worth, had sustained her through 3 decades of marriage and would sustain her for whatever years remained. Because real wealth was not found in bank accounts or property deeds. It was found in moments like this: sitting beside the person you loved, watching the sunrise, and knowing that you were exactly where you were meant to be. That was the legacy Grace would leave behind. Not land or money, but the lesson that true worth had nothing to do with dowries or social standing and everything to do with character and heart. That love was the greatest treasure, and partnership the most valuable asset. That when you found someone who saw your true value, who chose you for who you were rather than what you could bring, you had found something more precious than all the gold in the world. Grace Vernon had been rejected for having no dowry. But Grace Nash had built an empire of love, and that was all the wealth anyone could ever need. The cowboy who had looked past society's expectations and seen her true worth had given her everything that mattered. And together, they had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and build lasting meaning in a world too often focused on the wrong measures of value. As the morning light grew stronger and the ranch came to life around them, Grace and Isaac remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts entwined, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from it. This was their story, their triumph, their wealth. And it was more than enough. It was everything.